when we came to this location, we met a lot of resistance from the Lakurawas because this is one of their strongholds. And they usually come here in their 50s, 100s to carry out admin and go back to the bush.
Europe never thought the day would come when Africa would stop buying weapons and start building them. But in 2025, Nigeria forced the world to wake up. With drones that slashed costs, rifles that outperformed imports, and armored carriers that turned insurgencies into graveyards, Nigeria didn't just defend itself, it shattered a system built on African dependency. And if this is only the beginning, the question is not whether Africa is rising, but how much longer Europe can stomach the fall. Let's find out. If history is written in steel and circuitry, then 2025 marked the moment Nigeria finally picked up its own pen. For decades, the country was trapped in a cycle, importing rifles at inflated prices, begging for surveillance drones from allies, and patching armored vehicles built for European terrain, not African battlefields. It was a dependency disguised as a partnership. Yet beneath the surface, something was shifting. Workshops in Kaduna, research labs in Abuja, and hidden test fields far from the headlines were piecing together a future nobody in Brussels or Washington thought possible. That future roared to life in the form of Nigeria's DAMISA program. Unlike flashy Western unveilings where polished generals pose beside billion-dollar toys, DAMISA's rise was quiet, almost defiant. Engineers worked without the comfort of foreign blueprints. Universities pushed graduates into defense R&D, not just oil companies. And while the West was busy congratulating itself on training African officers, Nigerian scientists were teaching themselves to design motherboards, flight systems, and strike payloads. This wasn't a copycat job. It was innovation born of necessity, sharpened by frustration. DAMISA drones became the symbol of that new defiance. Built at a fraction of the cost of Turkish Bayraktars, they cut through the skies with purpose, monitor pipelines, track insurgents, and strike when needed. Oil theft, once a bleeding wound that drained Nigeria's lifeblood, was reduced from an eye-watering 100,000 barrels a day to just 5,000. That wasn't a statistic, it was sovereignty regained. Billions that once slipped through criminal networks and into foreign black markets were suddenly back in Nigerian coffers. But the real victory wasn't just in the numbers, it was in psychology. For the first time, Nigerian commanders could order missions without waiting on foreign approval, without phoning Washington or Ankara for replacement parts. A drone grounded in Lagos could be repaired by Nigerian technicians. A surveillance gap could be closed by Nigerian software. That independence on the battlefield was more valuable than any donation of aid from Europe. Then came the rifles and armored vehicles. Western media framed them as primitive experiments, as if Africa's factories were incapable of precision machining. Yet soldiers on the front lines in Zamfara and Borno carried them into firefights and found them not only reliable but tailored for African conditions, lighter weight for long treks in blistering heat, rugged enough to handle desert dust and rainforest mud alike. Meanwhile, Nigerian-made armored vehicles rolled across villages and borderlands where insurgents once ruled, proving that locally built steel could defend local soil. The significance of all this goes beyond combat statistics. It cuts into the heart of a centuries-old narrative, the idea that Africa is forever the consumer, never the creator. The DAMISA program and its cousins in rifles and vehicles tore down that fiction. Suddenly, Nigeria wasn't just equipping its military, it was owning its military destiny. And here's the part Europe won't admit: this wasn't supposed to happen. Every structure of global defense trade was designed to keep Africa dependent. NATO manuals insisted African armies weren't ready for self-sufficiency. World Bank policies funneled funds into importing, not building. Even African leaders themselves were pressured into contracts that guaranteed foreign suppliers a permanent role. DAMISA shattered that machinery overnight. But let's pause here. Because while it's tempting to celebrate the drones and the rifles as the victory itself, the real battlefield lies elsewhere. What does it mean when one of Africa's largest states starts building weapons not just for survival, but for independence? What does that do to the global arms casino that has treated Africa as its most loyal customer for decades? For decades, Nigerian leaders walked into that casino with oil money in their pockets and desperation in their eyes. They left with debt, dependency, and crates of weapons that looked good on paper but bled the treasury dry. The mechanics of this casino were simple. Whenever an insurgency flared, Western and Asian contractors showed up with their glossy brochures. Drones priced in the tens of millions. Armored trucks built for European highways rather than African dirt tracks. Rifles that came with a permanent bill for spare parts and maintenance. And because African states were told they lacked the capacity to produce their own, they signed away billions. The contracts were never really about security. They were about ensuring a revolving door of purchases. Insecurity meant repeat customers, and Africa was always invited back to the table. Nigeria's breakthrough has ripped that business model apart. The Demisa drones, silent predators built in local hangars, delivered more results in months than imported fleets achieved in years. Local armored carriers and rifles turned into symbols of practical independence. The casino thrives on helplessness, on the idea that only foreign chips can keep the game alive. But now, Nigeria walked out of the building, and the house doesn't know how to respond. European reaction has been telling. Defense contractors have lobbied their governments to monitor Nigeria's program, using the usual code words: human rights concerns, regional stability, risk of proliferation. These are not moral alarms, they're profit alarms. Every indigenous drone built in Nigeria is a drone not bought from Ankara or Paris. Every armored vehicle rolling out of Lagos is one less contract for Germany's Rheinmetall or France's Nexter. Nigeria's factories don't just build weapons, they cancel invoices in European boardrooms. The casino thrives on Africa's instability. If peace ever truly took hold, if African states secured their borders with their own tools, the demand for foreign contracts would collapse. Nigeria's indigenous success is not just a blow to profits, it is an existential threat to an industry that feeds on Africa's insecurity. It's why, in European think tanks, you now hear frantic talk of re-engagement strategies for Africa. That's polite language for trying to claw back influence before African defense production spreads. But here lies the bitter truth. The West was never in Africa to bring peace. Peace doesn't sell. For every Boko Haram raid, there was a contract waiting. For every oil pipeline sabotage, a foreign drone deal followed. The casino thrived because the table was rigged. Wars were prolonged, not solved, because insecurity kept the chips moving. Now, for the first time in modern history, Nigeria is showing that insecurity can be crushed without foreign suppliers taking a cut. That's why Europe is in shock, because the model they depended on is cracking. The deeper fear, however, is not just about Nigeria. If Abuja can do this, why not Addis Ababa? Why not Pretoria? Why not Algiers or Cairo? What happens when the idea of indigenous production becomes contagious, spreading across the continent until the entire African arms market shrinks out of Europe's reach? And that's the pivot point. Because this isn't only about weapons, it's about power. If Africa can break dependency in defense, then why not in energy, finance, or technology? Nigeria's drones are more than drones. They are a precedent. And precedents are dangerous to empires built on a monopoly. Which leads us to the next chapter of the story. If the collapse of the arms casino is underway, what does that mean for Africa's sovereignty? How does this shift from military dependency to military self-reliance change Africa's political independence in a world where power is defined by who makes the weapons? Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. If the collapse of the Western arms casino is the shock, then the question that follows is unavoidable. What does this mean for Africa's sovereignty? Because weapons are never just metal and circuitry, they are leveraging. And for more than a century, Africa's sovereignty was bartered away in contracts, aid packages, and security partnerships that ensured the continent could not stand on its own feet. Nigeria's breakthrough threatens to undo that system, and that frightens the very powers that once drew Africa's borders with a ruler and a rifle. For decades, sovereignty in Africa was more theater than reality. Countries flew their own flags, but their militaries were wired into foreign supply chains. Need spare parts? Call Paris. Need drones? Call Ankara. Need helicopters? Washington will lease you some. And with each call came conditions. Vote with us at the UN. Grant us basing rights. Accept our trainers on your soil. The weapons were not free. They were strings tied around African independence. This dependency produced absurd contradictions. Nigeria, Africa's largest oil producer, could not even secure its own oil pipelines without begging for foreign surveillance technology. Countries with rich mineral reserves signed defense deals that drained their budgets faster than insurgents drained their resources. Sovereignty was reduced to a ceremony because real sovereignty, the ability to secure your people and resources, was outsourced to others. Nigeria's indigenous weapons break that chain. A drone that takes off from Kaduna without a European technician hovering nearby is not just a drone, it is political defiance. A Nigerian-made armored vehicle patrolling Zamfara is not just steel on wheels. It is the physical proof that sovereignty no longer requires a stamp of approval from NATO headquarters. Sovereignty in this new paradigm is not declared at independence ceremonies. It is forged in factories, laboratories, and testing grounds. And the symbolism matters. For generations, African soldiers marched with rifles stamped "Made in Belgium" or "Made in the USA." The weapons were a constant reminder of dependence and unspoken humiliation in every conflict. Now, when a Nigerian soldier carries a rifle built in his own country, the psychology shifts. He is not just defending his homeland, he is embodying the idea that his homeland can defend itself. That shift, more than any number of contracts, marks the rebirth of sovereignty. Europe senses this, and it explains the sudden unease in Brussels and Paris. Because sovereignty built on local strength cannot be manipulated by the usual tricks. If an African state no longer needs French bases for security, then France loses the political leverage those bases provided. If Nigeria can crush oil theft without American drones, then Washington loses the diplomatic bargaining chip of assistance. The old colonial game depended on dependency. Independence backed by indigenous power flips the board. But here lies the deeper question. If Nigeria can build sovereignty through weapons, can Africa extend that sovereignty across its borders? Because true independence is not achieved in isolation. Sovereignty is fragile if it can be strangled by the supply chain of a single nation. Nigeria's leap raises the stakes for the entire continent. Should Africa continue as a collection of fragmented states, each struggling alone, or should it pool this new strength into a continental force that cannot be dictated to from abroad? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video, and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. Sovereignty must be collective, or else it remains vulnerable. That is why Abuja has begun to float what may become Europe's greatest nightmare, an African Defense Production Alliance. To understand why this idea shakes Western capitals, you have to remember how Africa has been kept weak for centuries. Fragmentation was not an accident, it was a design. Colonizers carved the continent into dozens of states, each too small to defend itself, each too dependent on foreign suppliers. Even after independence, the pattern stuck. Mali depended on France, Kenya leaned on the United States, Egypt bought from Russia. No African state could dictate the terms of its own security because no African state had scale. That was the old game. But imagine what changes if Africa flips the script. Nigeria, Africa's most populous nation, already produces drones, rifles, and armored vehicles tailored to the continent's realities. South Africa still retains its decades-old expertise in defense engineering. Egypt and Algeria operate some of the largest militaries on the continent. Ethiopia has the human capital and determination to innovate despite sanctions and pressure. Combine these strengths under one industrial alliance, and suddenly Africa no longer needs to beg Europe for protection. It can defend itself, on its own terms, with its own tools. This is precisely why European defense analysts whisper in alarm about Nigeria's new ambitions. A single Nigerian building drone is a problem, but a coalition of African states sharing production lines, coordinating research, and trading weapons internally. That is a direct threat to Europe's last standing leverage in Africa. Because once the alliance exists, no Western contractor can dangle overpriced deals in front of desperate African governments. No foreign base can justify its presence by claiming security gaps. An African alliance closes those gaps itself, and Europe knows it. Already, subtle pushback has begun. Reports emerge of EU diplomats warning about regional destabilization if African states begin producing weapons en masse. Think tank papers stress the risk of proliferation, as if Africans are children who can't be trusted with their own factories. These narratives are not about stability, they are about fear. Fear that an alliance would end Europe's monopoly, not just on weapons, but on influence. Because let's be honest, Europe's influence in Africa today is thinly disguised behind military dependency. France keeps troops in the Sahel not out of generosity, but because without them, its political relevance in West Africa vanishes. The EU funds training missions, not because it cares about African soldiers, but because the missions keep Europe at the table. Strip away dependency, and what's left? Very little. That's what the African Defense Production Alliance threatens. Irrelevance for Europe, empowerment for Africa. And here's the most important point. The alliance is not a fantasy. The building blocks are already visible. Nigeria has the drones. South Africa has an advanced industry. Ethiopia has tested homegrown designs. Egypt has mass production capacity. Algeria has money and heavy armor expertise. Even smaller nations like Burkina Faso and Mali, once considered weak, are politically hungry for independence after ejecting French forces. If these ingredients are stirred together, the result will be a continental machine the West cannot control. So the question is no longer whether Europe is terrified. The real question is, what happens when the alliance takes shape? What does Europe do when it can no longer dictate security terms to Africa? For centuries, Europe's dominance over Africa wasn't simply about colonies, borders, or resources. It was about control of the tools of violence. Whoever makes the weapons makes the rules. That was the logic of empire, from Maxim guns that mowed down African resistors in the 19th century to French fighter jets stationed across the Sahel in the 21st. Europe's authority came from the monopoly of production, not just the projection of power. Now that the monopoly is slipping, and the authority that came with it is eroding at a pace Europe cannot stop. The early signs of this panic are already visible. European think tanks are publishing papers describing Nigeria's breakthrough as a destabilizing factor in global security markets. Translation: Africa producing its own weapons is destabilizing only for those who profited from selling them. EU officials whisper about engagement opportunities with Nigeria, hoping to reinsert themselves before the alliance hardens. Defense contractors quietly push their governments to slow African projects through regulation, embargoes, or even covert pressure. None of it will work. Because once a continent learns it can build for itself, there is no way back to dependency, and yet, this is precisely where Africa's dawn begins. For the first time in modern history, Africans are no longer debating whether to buy American, French, Russian, or Turkish equipment. They are debating how to build Nigerian, South African, Egyptian, or Ethiopian. That shift alone marks the beginning of a new epoch. Sovereignty is no longer a dream. It is hardware rolling off production lines. Independence is no longer ceremonial. It is drones flying missions designed in African labs. The symbolism of this cannot be overstated. Every Nigerian-built drone that takes flight is not just defending a pipeline, it is dismantling the colonial myth that Africa cannot innovate. Every armored vehicle forged in an African factory is not just steel, it is sovereignty with wheels. Every rifle in the hands of an African soldier stamped "Made in Africa" is not just a weapon. It is a declaration that the continent refuses to be infantilized any longer. Europe feels this shift in its bones, even if it won't say it outright. Its greatest fear is not war, it is irrelevance. What leverage does France hold in the Sahel once African states equip themselves without French bases? What bargaining power does Brussels have at African summits once African leaders can say, "We defend ourselves, we don't need your trainers"? What role does Europe play in Africa's future if Africa no longer requires its contracts, its lectures, or its military crutches? That irrelevance is Europe's bitter pill. And for Africa, that irrelevance is liberation. Because the dawn of African defense production is about more than weapons, it is about rewriting the rules of engagement between Africa and the world. For too long, Africa has been the passive object of geopolitics, acted upon rather than acting. In 2025, with Nigeria's leap, Africa took the first steps toward becoming the subject of its own story. And here is the deeper irony. Europe cannot stop it. It can stall, it can sabotage, it can smear, but it cannot reverse the realization that has now spread across the continent. Africa has tasted self-reliance, and once tasted, dependency becomes unbearable. So as Europe scrambles to adjust, Africa's path is set. The continent that was once armed to be enslaved is now arming itself to be free. That is not just a turning point in Africa's story, it is the end of Europe's illusion of control. The casino is closed, the leash has snapped, and the leopard is awake. This is Africa's dawn, and no empire can cage it again. Do you think Africa is finally breaking free from centuries of dependency? Let us know in the comment section. How long do you believe Europe can ignore Nigeria's new power? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.